Yeah, thanks for that. And yeah, thanks to both of you for inviting me to do this seminar and for all y'all who I guess are in different places, but whether it's your lunch break or whatever, it's 8 a.m. for me. So I hope you all give me a moment of, and of course my kids didn't sleep last night, so it had to be one of those evenings. But I'm sort of really excited to be here as well. Like many of you, I've spent the last year or so in this Zoom, hellscape and haven't really had much time to think about my own work because doing mostly teaching related stuff. So this is the first time in a while I got to sit back and really think about what look at my research and think about what's going on in these sort of really cool questions. So I'm very grateful for that. And yeah, if you have any questions, I guess use the chat or we can talk later. And if I'm talking too fast, just let me know as well. Just a quick sort of a content warning note. Talking about warfare and violence, it does sort of can be difficult for some people. And I will be showing some images of human skeletal remains. So I want to keep that in mind. And as well to note that I'm coming from Appalachian State University in Boone, North Carolina, which is traditionally a Cherokee lands. So the research I've been doing in the last couple of years, different sort of questions that I think actually all relate. So one of my sort of research questions has been, what is symbolic thought? And what is this thing actually that we talk about as humans being symbolic thinkers? What does it mean to be a symbolic thinker? And, when did it evolve? And then why did it evolve? And then also, in sort of a circuitous way, got involved in this question of the role of collective violence and the origins of warfare. And as somebody who, when I was a graduate student, I took an archaeology seminar, a theory seminar, and we had to go around the room and say, what are the most big questions in your field? And I was the only paleoanthropologist in the group. And I said, oh, well, I think it's probably the warfare stuff and the modern human origin stuff. And those are two things I would never want to discuss because it's so contentious. And so, a lot of very argumentative field. And I think that sort of maybe keeps some people away from it, or at least certain types of people who are like me are pretty laid back. But I think it's really important questions to think about, especially how it relates to that third point, the fact that how does popular science, how does popular culture and the media present these data? And in fact, the work I'm working on right now, and this is very preliminary stuff, but I'm happy to sort of talk about it more with y'all, is sort of what does the educated person think about these questions? Where are they going to get their questions on, is human nature, innately violent and innately peaceful? What does evolution mean? And how do people, for lack of a better word, how does sort of someone who's like reading the literature outside of anthropology and archaeology, what do they think about these questions? So they have been doing this, some of these are really good books, I think, but looking at the sort of the published literature and saying, okay, books written for the public, what are they learning about human origins, right? What are they learning about our innate behaviors? Because while often I think they do a good job, some folks, especially those outside of sort of archaeology and anthropology, will take the data that we curate and discuss and perhaps explain it or present it in ways that make it either seem too rigorous, too definitive, or maybe in problematic ways. And that's sort of one of the things I've been thinking about a lot lately. And the point being, of course, that questions about warfare and how old it is are not new things, right? These have been questions people have asked for a long time. The former president of the United States, Barack Obama, in 2009, accepting his Nobel Prize acceptance speech, noted that war had been around since the first man, and that morality was not questioned. It was just sort of a fact. I think something that's underappreciated is Obama's mother was an anthropologist. So certainly he was aware of this perhaps cultural notions of what is war and how old it is. From the other side of the pond and other side of the political persuasion, perhaps Winston Churchill also commenting that the story of humans is war, and that there's been very few moments of peace, and that before history, whatever, whatever that means, there was murderous strife that was universal and unending. And here's sort of two politicians. Other folks take these data as well. You maybe luckily don't know who Jonah Goldberg is. He's a political thinker in the United States, where in one of his books, he talks about how anyone who debates the fact or questions the fact that we are innately violent are not scientists. And a lot of folks will say this in their books, right? That we know that the Pleistocene, it was a time rife with fighting and infighting and interpersonal violence, and that was probably the prime mover in human evolution, right? That sometimes specifically male on male violence is a driver of human origins, and that these are undisputed facts. And this is a very common trope out there. So far be it for me to dispute something that's undisputed, but I want to point out that this is not undisputed, right? Back in 1940, Margaret Mead, an American anthropologist, that kind of infamously said, well, warfare is just a human invention like any other human invention. It's just like marriage or trial by jury. And it's just a thing that exists and doesn't have to exist. Slightly more recently, the archaeologist Sally Binford pointed out that we're not doomed to act out a drama whose lines were written millions of years ago. I sort of love her sort of gift with words and the fact that how she puts it, that complex truths often fail to catch up with the sort of simple, attractive lie, which is actually a fairly good point, I think, of today's modern political landscape as well, right? So I'm a huge fan of Sally Binford's work, and I think she sort of reminds us that we have to sometimes, think about, are these really the way it is? What can we say about the past? And again, I don't know exactly the backgrounds of everyone in this session, but we do know a lot about life of our ancestors, right? That's what most of us study. A lot of study for a living is sort of like, what was life like for our ancestors? And I think, and historians of science have looked at this question, but I still think there's more to look at, is the narrative of why we tend to argue, at least in the popular imagination, that part of this was, violence. Going back and before, very famously to Raymond Dart, who was it Australopithecus africanus, arguing that they were these bloodthirsty, savage beasts that would rip the shreds off the bones of other hominins. We have this notion that it's violence, and the violence is just driving evolution. So much so that via a couple of steps, 2001: A Space Odyssey with that the hominin taking the femur, that's coming essentially from Raymond Dart's work. So there's this narrative that we are violent by nature, and that maybe that doesn't mean we're violent now, but that is the case, and that's undisputed. So that's sort of the questions that my colleague Nam Kim and I have been talking about for the last couple of years is, well, what do we really know about the past? I'm a biological anthropologist, and Nam is an archaeologist whose work primarily was in Vietnam, working with some of the earliest cities in Vietnam, in these walled cities. So both of us have sort of some interest in these questions, but coming from different backgrounds. And I'm happy if anyone talk later about how we actually got to doing this kind of research. But the question we had is, what is war really like in the past? And again, I don't know where y'all are coming from. These are questions that are, very, very prominent in some sense, in some disciplines, and especially in sort of archaeology and anthropology, because we have access to the sort of long time period. So some folks argue that war is very, very old, right? There's an old thing, it's been around for a long time. Steven Pinker, who's a evolutionary psychologist at Harvard, has argued for a while now that anytime almost every body we find from 10,000 years ago and later in time shows signs of interpersonal violence, and that this shows that it was a dark and dismal time. And fairly provocatively, Pinker has argued in the last 10 or so years that we've gotten more peaceable. We've gotten more peaceful since the origins of the state. So his argument essentially is that the state-level societies prevent our maybe innate tendencies to wanting to kill each other. And if you haven't read his book, I mean, it's pretty thick, but like, it's really an amazing sort of hypothesis. Others have sort of taken a different track, right? And they say, no, 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 no. Warfare is a product of civilization. Sure, people might be violent, but the actual kind of direct coalitional violence that we see today is a product of people living in states. And I want to point out that both groups are more nuanced than that. And sometimes it comes off as like saying, calling them the hawks versus the doves. Excuse me. So like the Harvard hawks are the ones who see they're violent, and the doves, like Doug Fry and others, think humans are innately peaceful, and it's just that the state kind of drives us to being violent. And that's sort of where sort of the stage was set when we were thinking about these questions. A couple of things to point out. One, it's kind of an obvious point, especially for grad students who are really invested in these debates, is like, what definition are you even using, right? So I think one thing that's underappreciated, even though it's also fairly obvious, is the definition you use for warfare is going to affect how you see it in the past, right? So like, if you're a cultural anthropologist, you may have one definition, right? Or Manilowski's definition as well. Whereas you're looking from an evolutionary psychology standpoint, it might be a bit different. Or if you have if you're a primatologist like Richard Wrangham and Luke Glowacki, your definition might be set in a way that you can perhaps see evidence of warfare in other non-human primates. And then, how do you sort of, or is, aggression and violence between socially distinct or autonomous groups of people? Like, every definition is going to have problems. And I think that we need to be just clear that at the get-go, right? When we were working on our stuff originally, we tried to have a definition that could be evolutionarily relevant. Many of the definitions from political science and military historians aren't really relevant because you're not seeing sort of the long time period. So this leads to the question of sort of, okay, when did human warfare evolve? I was told by a colleague to always show evidence that I know what I'm talking about. So here's some of the stuff that my colleague Nam Kim and I have been working on for the last couple of years, to sort of put it into perspective as to like, what I'm sorry, I just lost my picture, what kind of stuff we're talking about. And the whole genesis of this project was essentially these sort of small group meetings that Lucy is setting up, where Nam and I were chatting about some of these ideas, and we're like, well, what really do we know about the past? And is there a good book that we could assign to students that will cover this from an anthropological perspective? Which is sort of where we came to work on this book that we wrote, Emergent Warfare in Our Past. So again, how do we know what happened in the past? And again, I think that for a lot of you, this is maybe a bit of a review, but you can look at genetics, right? You can look at the genes and say, are some humans more innately violent than others because we have a genetic tendency to be violent? A couple of years back, this was known as the warrior gene. And you could take a test and you could spin to a test tube and send your money off to a company and get back whether or not you're innately violent or not. I would suggest that's probably a little more complex than that. These genes, there's no gene for violence, right? There are genes that under certain conditions might presuppose you to acting more violently, but those conditions are really, really complex. So at this point, maybe not so much, but it could possibly be that we can see these changes over time. A lot of folks, and I think very interestingly, looking at chimpanzees and other non-human primates, and what do they do? Jane Goodall talking about warfare and chimps, and not later Richard Wrangham and his students. A lot of really amazing evidence comes out of these discussions, right? And it becomes the debate is how relevant are these data to understanding human warfare? And you can probably read the data in either way. You can say it's very relevant because chimps and us are very closely related. So things that they do inform on things that we used to do or we did. Others look at the data and say, well, chimps and humans have diverged from 7 million years. Maybe chimpanzees are also highly derived compared to the last common ancestor. So who knows? Maybe they're not that relevant. You can look at the archaeology as something that Dr. Milks does very, very well, I think. Looking at the weaponry, and weapons might have been developed hunting, But, you don't have to be, a genius to figure out that if you're hunting an eland with a spear, you also can hunt not your friend, hopefully, but somebody, right? Who's your enemy. One of, I think, the more controversial aspects is using ethnographic analogy, looking at what do modern foragers or historically known foragers do. And I think that's also a really cool avenue as well. We can get some basis of understanding how different, I mean, they're all modern humans. So how do modern human societies living in contemporary world and globalization, how do they deal with conflict and conflict resolution? You can look at the archaeology itself, right? The settlement patterns. So sites like Mohenjo-Daro or Harappa in the Indus Valley, where you have walls. And walls that tend to say, okay, this is for protection or for armies. Though Marc Kissel, who works at Harappa, has argued that the walls are there not for protection against armies, but for control of taxation and economic control. So it's really tricky, as we all know. And then I think the one that has received the most attention is the bioarchaeology, right? So looking at the surface modifications on bones and saying, well, did past humans die violently? How did they die? And what was it like was it interpersonal violence? Was it an accident and so forth? And I think it is fairly well known, but it should be pointed out, right? That I'm not a bioarchaeologist, but there's this equifinality problem, right? Is that you find a broken ulna, is that inherently because it's a peri mark or somebody blocked, a sword coming at them, or did they fall and break the ulna? And now we're becoming better at sort of telling the difference between the two. But in 100 years ago, when someone reported, oh, this ulna was broken, is that a legitimate indicator of violence? I think is a good question. And I have my original training as a taphonomist, so anytime I get to look at bones, I get very excited. So what is the early evidence of interpersonal violence? Right? So evidence of people like being killed by other people or other hominins. And you can sort of find things like, it's Dirkfontein, where 1.5 million years old or so, we have a skull. I'm sorry, it's so small, a skull of Australopithecine that looks like it has the fleshing marks on it. Probably a better example, more famously, is Bodo at 600,000 years. If it's Homo heidelbergensis or early Homo sapiens, I'm not going to touch that issue, but it is some hominin that looks like it has cut marks on the orbits that perhaps suggest that it was defleshed, so maybe eaten by somebody else. Now, no one would say that's warfare, I don't think, but it does show that like this sort of violence against other members of our species may have been more common than we want to believe. A little more more recently, right? Though still fairly old, you have like something like Grandolina, in Spain, where we have about 800,000 years ago or so, these hominins. Some would call them Homo erectus, not Homo antecessor, or you can call them early Neanderthals, whatever you want to call them. But it's an amazing site where a lot of fossils and many of the hominins are being eaten by other hominins. Right? We have good evidence of cut marks on their bones where Homo antecessor is being treated like any other fauna. Why I think this is interesting is that it looks like we see evidence that they're eating not their family, but like what's called exo-cannibalism. So they're eating people outside of their group. And if that's true, that's kind of interesting because some of the scholars have suggested that they were maybe purposely eating rival folk to maybe lower their numbers of their rivals. Now, if that is true, what does that mean, right? Because Keith Otterbein, who's a scholar of war, when he learned about this, he wrote a really fascinating piece where he's like, this is probably the first warfare. Because the first evidence of warfare, because you have one group attacking another group and on purpose. It gets, of course, really complicated. Is that warfare? Is it not? I think really boils down to how you define war. And then also, like, do you buy the sort of interpretation? which is the other huge issue for archaeology, right? Is that you can look at the same site and have different interpretations. I think that the quintessential example of this would be something like, maybe Jebel Sahaba, which at 12,000 years old, up until fairly recently, was the oldest evidence of really good, of what might be warfare, where you have sort of a massacre site or a couple of individuals have been killed over time violently. And, I don't want to attack non-archaeologists, but I think without sort of the non-archaeologists who talk about these data often present Jebel Sahaba as definitive proof of warfare and violence. But one of the things we have to be aware of, right, is that some of the bones are now missing, and the counts of how many people actually died there, is it 60% or is it 30% or 20%, are debated, which doesn't mean that there wasn't interpersonal violence, but I think we need to be careful about this. Similarly, got a lot of attention in the last, like 3 or 4 years ago, is Narok in Kenya. We have a site about 10,000 years old that looks like what you'd expect to find in a massacre. And in fact, Nam Kim and I, when we were first working on our first draft of our book, before Narok came out, we had said something like, we predict that you would find sites that show massacres 10, 20, 30,000 years ago. And then like this paper came out as we were working on it. So this site had like 12 individuals, 10 of which I believe show signs of interpersonal violence. And the argument is they were all killed at the same time in some sort of massacre event, which, would be good evidence of something. Is it war? Is it not? Is another question. Oh, someone's from Sudan. That's awesome. I will also point out for Narok as well that, as always is the case, archaeologists disagree, and there's a group of people from ASU, Arizona State University, which I call the other ASU because I'm at Appalachian State University. So we're the real ASU and they're the fake one. But the folks out of ASU have argued that they sort of have critiqued this interpretation that it is everyone died at once in the site. So why am I going over this? I know a lot of you probably know this. The point is that, in the popular literature, it comes out like things like this. A science writer and a skeptic, Michael Shermer, says in his book that if you lived 10,000 years ago and were a man, there's about a 1 in 4 chance that you would die violently. And, gift of words for sure, but I have no idea how you would know that. It'd be really good to know that, right? But do we ever have the resolution to know something like that? I don't know. And I think that it does sort of show how we sort of how our data are being used sometimes. And then Sherman got I don't want to pick on Michael, but like he got very excited after Narok came out because he's like, look, this proves that humans are innately warlike because this site shows warfare. And again, maybe it does, but as an anthropologist, 10,000 years ago is really not that long ago. And doesn't maybe really tell us so much about human origin, human nature, right? Because this is a site of essentially a Neolithic site. So I think that we need to be careful and think about sort of how are data being told. The second piece of thing I wanted to talk to you all about today, and then I'll rather hear you all talk, is the debate on war group size. So sort of a bit of a backstory here that Steven Pinker's book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, very popular, at least in the States, about warfare and violence. In his book, he references some of the work by Larry Keeley, who wrote this book, War Before Civilization. And in War Before Civilization, Larry sort of states an interesting observation that in what you might call traditional societies or non-industrial societies and foraging populations, the number of people involved in war groups is fairly high. So about 40% of the people in a group could be part of that coalitionary violence of a raiding party or what have you. And he said that's pretty high. And then folks looked into this and found that in humans, in sort of more complex societies, in sort of state level societies, what we see is that that number drops from about 40% to about 1%. So in a state level society, there's less people involved in war. And this had been used by Pinker and others to say, okay, look, this shows that that we were violent at one point, but we're not anymore because the state has made us less violent. So the question that my colleagues and I had is it this simple? And again, one of the benefits of like traveling and being a postdoc is you get to, sorry, you get to work with some really amazing and interesting people. And my colleague Rahul Oka was talking about this issue one day with him in the hallway. And he said something random. He was like, what if this drop is due to issues that appear as population size increases? And my advice to any of the students here is when someone tells you something randomly, it's nice to write it down and come back to it. Because this led to us writing a paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences with the very provocative title, right, Population is the Main Driver of War Group Size and Conflict Casualties. And I thought no one would pay attention to this, but I very quickly learned what a slow news day means in the United States because we had reporters calling us. It was very interesting to see what people care about. I'm going to talk you, we have 20 minutes. I'm going to try to say what we said in this paper a bit. And if anyone has any questions afterward, or they can always send me an email, I'm happy to send you the paper and talk about it. Rahul is an archaeologist and cultural anthropologist, and also a math whiz. So a lot of this was sort of him translating into math and then us thinking about it, these questions. There's a lot of text on this slide, and I do apologize for that. But I wanted to sort of be clear what we were trying to say, because also some of the response, I think maybe we weren't clear enough on our end, but I want to be clear, is that what we were asking is this drop in the number of people involved in war, is it due to the effects of people living in the state? So in other words, is the state making people more peaceful and less people wanting to go to war or what have you? Or is it a reflection of these broader issues related to population size? So as population goes up, yes, the proportion of people involved in a conflict does decrease, does go down, but why? So what we did is we collected data on population and war group size from about 300 societies, and then data from specific historical conflicts. And there's a newish paper out that sort of pushes back on some of the way we collected the data. And I do admit that, these numbers of like conflict casualties, really hard to know for sure, right? Do they over or underestimate these data points is really hard to know. I would sort of suggest that we have enough samples, you're going to sort of cover that wiggle room, but it is a fair point and something that we're working to address now. But that what we sort of suggest is this, and it's a fairly obvious point, but that as population, it's not that specifically that states prevent violence. Is that this drop in the number of people involved in war, this ratio, this war group size, is related to other factors that make it harder to involve a large percentage of people in more complex societies. So what we mean by that is that, what we mean by that is like, in a small population of 100 people, 40% can easily be in the war group, like 40 people, it's not hard. But if you have 100 million people, you're not going to have 40 million people involved in a war effort, involved in the coalitionary violence, because you can't feed them, you can't clothe them, you can't train them, and you certainly can't control them. So I think something that was sort of what our main point was. And God bless my wife, when I told her the paper was accepted, she's like, sounds like an obvious idea. Why would anyone need to publish on that? But it was kind of fun. So basically, I'll sort of show you the data. This is sort of population size on the x-axis and the overall group size on the y-axis, showing as population size increases, yes, more people involved in war because there's more people in that group. But that if you look at the relationship between population size on the x-axis and the proportion of societies involved in coalitional violence on the y-axis, and these are log scaled, you sort of see a different relationship. But I can talk about that later if you want. And so you can see where the data comes from. But that relationship is based upon the ratio. And I said this was I learned a slow news day. We got all kinds of cool press, even in Italian, which I thought was really awesome. And the epic part of my life was Science magazine covered it, and they reached out to Steven Pinker, right? This guy who wrote the book saying that we're all peaceful now. And Pinker apparently saw it as an attack on his research, which, yeah, fair enough. But so then he sort of got to read our paper. I thought it was pretty cool. And he wasn't a fan of it, but at least he had to think about it. So I think that's pretty fun. And I think shows sort of the benefit of like these transdisciplinary research teams where we get to like look at things, right? I'm a paleoanthropologist who learned population genetics, talking about warfare. There's benefits and drawbacks there, right? But it kind of does show the benefit, I think, of coming into these fields. Another bit that we're working on now related to this is what Rahul has called demographic conflict investment. And essentially what that question was is, can we calculate the number of individuals involved in conflict, accounting for the scale in population? In other words, can we take into effect the scaling law, the fact that you can't, as you scale up, you can't have as many people involved in the war effort ratio-wise. Can we take that into effect? And if you do, what do you find? Well, what we found is actually that there's no difference in the amount of conflict investment between most small-scale societies and most state-level societies for most of the time, other than when there's a direct, like, World War I kind of affects this, obviously. And like some other measurements of sort of militarization, DCI kind of correlates fairly well with other measurements, but it allows us to do things to apply to any other economic and social systems where most of the militarized things tends to be only for industrialized societies. So what this looks like, here's the UK, my home and some of your homes, special relationship, right, as the politicians love to call it, where you can sort of see how those DCI values change over time from like the US not being very highly invested, and then here comes the Civil War, we invest a lot in conflict, and then sort of different world events like World War I and World War II, the Korean War, how different coalitions are affected by these sort of these events. And again, this is outside of sort of archaeology really, but some people have asked, like, can we use this to talk about deep time? I'm not so sure, because you do need to have data on population size. And your colleague, Jennifer French, I've learned a lot from her work too about demographics and thinking about these questions. Just to show you what this might look like over time, we sort of see in these different like countries, right? And how DCI is affected, that like there is something going on here, perhaps we can track the change over time. This is going very slow. But basically, that's the United States responding to the Civil War. And what we could see, let me speed up a bit, like when you have like something like World War I coming up, many countries respond to that event, and then they sort of go back to like, so what we're working on now is, can we do some network analysis and stuff like this? Right, so that's sort of the data, what we've been playing around with. And I'm going to go out on a limb here and say what I'm actually thinking these days about all these questions. And where Nam, my colleagues and I are, where we're moving, what we're thinking is going on here. And then I would love to hear, any comments or thoughts you all have. So I would think that there's probably not many unequivocal signs of direct sort of violence in the pre-Holocene skeletal remains. And by unequivocal, we mean like really, really good, high quality data. Yes, there's some good examples of this, but it's really hard because I think there's sometimes like a file drawer problem here, right? Like in medicine, where if you go out and study a population that doesn't show interpersonal violence, you're probably not going to publish, hey, in Nature saying, hey, this site didn't have interpersonal violence. So what gets attention, if it bleeds, it leads sort of is, I think, a big problem here in terms of how we can count how many people were dying of violence in the deep past. But this doesn't mean that warfare didn't exist. And as someone who came to this question thinking that warfare is a fairly recent human invention, I'll say that I'm sort of, hedging a bit now on what I actually think. So we've been talking in our work recently about this idea of emergent warfare or emergent violence, that the socially cooperative violence that might not adhere to the type of warfare that we think about, but still has basic elements like cooperation, cooperative decision-making, and strategies to use aggression and intimidation and violence to affect social outcomes. And our argument, which I know is controversial, is that these kinds of things could have been possible way earlier, because it's probably traced, both warfare and peacefare, the way humans do it, is probably connected to the emergence of human symbolic thought. Because once you can make connections, right? once you think symbolically, when you can look at an object and it can stand for something just because everyone agrees that's what it stands for, right? Like a red light meaning stop. That's the basis of language. Once you have language, once you have symbolic thought, then you can sort of create these really complex institutions that allow for both war and for peace. So in other words, to be specific about what we're suggesting is that early modern humans would have been quite capable of developing these cultural institutions. And again, like I'm not a huge fan of the word early modern human because it's kind of it's a what do you call it? But essentially, I would say by Homo sapiens, 200, 300,000 years old, I would think they would have the capability of doing this. They probably didn't, or at least we're not going to find good evidence of that, right? Because it's just so ephemeral. You have diagenesis and all these other problems that make it hard to find. But that, and here's where I think we're going more out on a limb, is that perhaps it's not that this sort of violence and aggression is a driver of human evolution, but rather it's epiphenomenal. It was a result of these human cognitive changes and became important because of that. And at the same time, that the ability to, convince someone to come to a war group, go and attack someone you never met, that also involves a level of cooperation and, community. And much like your colleague at Liverpool, Penny Spikins, has spoken of, right? We need to think about the role of compassion in human origins as well. However repugnant and evil war is, it is a very collaborative effort, right? Where people come together and oftentimes fight people they don't know, I have no personal animosity toward. And it's impressive that like how leaders and politicians have sort of co-opted perhaps some sort of innate desire to protect ourselves and use that in maybe insidious ways. And where we're sort of I sort of titled this Peacefare and Warfare, right? I am a pretty peaceable guy. So like, I'm actually more interested in the question of peace. Like, where's that coming from, right? And we know from non-human primates, we can look at sort of how non-human animals do sort of make peace and conciliation. And but humans are very, very good at it, right? And maybe maybe peacemaking results from the same human capacities. This is, the name escapes me. The sculpture's name fell off, I'm sorry for that. In front of the UN, this sort of famous like non-violence, this pistol that's tagged in a knot, that I believe the first version of it was made after John Lennon died. That, people like peace, right? And that we're good at fighting, but also really good at avoiding fighting. I don't remember how many years ago it was now, Sarah Hrdy, the anthropologist, in one of her books points out that like, if you put a bunch of chimpanzees on an airplane, they're gonna kill each other very, very quickly. Most humans on an airplane are not gonna kill each other because we're actually fairly good at getting along. And that war and peace are outcomes of this sort of complex cognition. So what we're sort of playing around with now is that peace is sort of a condition that's safeguarded through really elaborate social networks. Work coming out recently on like the Turkana, and when the Turkana go and raise, what happens when they come back? How do they deal with sort of the stresses of being amongst violence? I think is really, really interesting because we can see that the response to like what some have called like post-traumatic stress disorder in military from the United States, and then the same response from like the Turkana who are also going through violence is different. They both suffer from PTSD, but different responses because of the cultural practices that exist, that allow peace to be a thing and how we sort of deal with this kind of stuff. All right, so where was I going? I lost my, yeah. So something from our work, essentially, is I would suggest, go out on a limb here, right, that we're not more or less violent than our forebears. We are humans and humans do human things. Some of us are peaceful, some of us are violent. And many of us will be violent in situations where we need to be. And even the most violent person will be peaceful sometimes, right? And it's not that we become less violent over time, I would suggest, or we become more violent over time. It's that violence is culturally mediated. there's so many different kinds of violence out there. You know, we tend to think as anthropologists and archaeologists about interpersonal violence, because that's the thing we could see through weaponry, right? Through bioarchaeology. But there's, you know, other kinds of violence. There's structural violence. Nowadays, you know, Rob Nixon has spoken of slow violence over time due to the environment. And, you know, not many of us have really thought about, like, is structural violence a thing for Neanderthals? I don't know. That'd be really hard to prove, but something we want to think about, at least in terms of the more recent past. Hagen Klaus, who's a bioarchaeologist, has written about, you know, structural violence in bioarchaeology. Can we think about these things, or at least be clear that violence is not just one thing that you can sort of quantify very easily? And I didn't get a chance to talk about this, but also just to be clear that, you know, women and female aggression is also important. And a lot of these sort of public or popular accounts tend to think about in terms of only men driving human evolution. And that's something else I think that we need to really think a lot about. Blah, blah, blah. Okay, so just also 2 quick quotes to sum up that, you know, other people are thinking about these things too. Richard Wrangham pointing out, right, that, you know, any theory of violence can have moral implications. We have to think about that fact. Or Doug Fry and colleagues, that in any case, the existence of peaceful societies demonstrates that humans can construct social worlds that are virtually free of lethal violence. So there is a possibility, right? The human capacity for peace is something that I think we need to think more about. And we need to sort of, you know, problematize and research just as we think about the human capacity for warfare. Because I don't think they're 2 sides of the same coin. I think they're all responses to other things going on. Blah, 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 blah. So yeah, I mean, you can sort of, you know, read that, I suppose. You know, in the end, I think my point, right, is that the emergence of War and Peace is sort of aspects of the human niche. And that, you know, may have happened in the Pleistocene. It's really going to be hard to tell. But in order to do this, we need sort of, you know, I think what I would call anthropological thinking. And we need to be championing this research in the public sphere. We can't just talk to each other. And we need to go out there and say, hey, look, when people post or talk about things that are wrong, we have to push back against that. So I want to thank everyone all of you for showing up, and what I think for many of you is your lunch hour. And Lucy and Carys for inviting me. It took me like an hour to figure out how to make the app state thing do that. So I was very proud of myself to make it like do that wiggle thing. So yeah, if you have any questions, I guess I can keep I'm happy to sort of take them. But yeah, it's been great. And I guess I can stop sharing my screen, or I can maybe figure out how to do that. But lived on Zoom for how long, and I still forget how to do these things. But yeah, also, if you don't want to ask a question now, you can find me online, AppState, or send me an email or Twitter or whatever you want.
Right, okay, thanks, Mark. So we do have a couple of questions in the chat already.
Oh,
so
cool.
I will read out the first one. So Hugh says, many of the ideas you mentioned have passed into popular culture, possibly from popular science books. In popular discussion, for example, online, people often cite supposedly scientific conclusions from evolutionary psychology, primate studies, genetics, anthropology and archaeology, etc., about what human nature is or used to be. Often these are garbled or incorrect. So do you have any comment on how these ideas are co-opted to support political and social narratives?
No, thanks for that. Yeah, that's kind of what I was hinting at, I think. But yeah, I can be more explicit and I'll lay it out. Yeah, I mean, politicians all the time use these things, right? How to put this to be being recorded, the former president of the United States, up until fairly recently, you know, was very big, I think, not on arguing about how his genes made him a better person, made him better, right? And you know, I don't think most people who write about these things would say that it's a good thing that we're innately violent, if that's what they're arguing. But certainly there are some suggestions, right, that, well, humans, I'm gonna take this a different way. I have seen, and maybe this is where the question's coming from, I have seen the notion, well, look, humans are innately violent. We're innately going to put ourselves into groups. So we shouldn't be surprised when these things happen. Some dark reaches of the internet will look at like the police violence in the United States and say, well, that's going to happen when you have groupthink. And that, I think, is, yeah, all ideas being co-opted outside of anthropology and archaeology and used in, I think, very problematic ways. As to what, or, you know, 2 or 3 years ago, the New York Times had a piece that white supremacists were drinking a lot of milk because they thought by drinking milk, it made them prove that they were white. And yeah, I mean, you could easily push back and say, well, you know, the genes that allow, the alleles that allow for milk drinking are also found in North Africa. And I think that's one way to do it. But I think it's also like, yeah, we have to be clear about this thing. We have to push back against the racist and not let them use our stuff, because there's a, I can talk about this for hours, but I do think our science is more relevant to many people than a lot of other sciences, because we're talking about human origins. Everyone cares about that. And yeah, I think we have to be careful. I think we have to really think about it. And when people use anthropology wrong, we can't be quiet, because those conversations are going to happen no matter what. Like I said, you know, for 8 years, the president of the United States' mom was an anthropologist. And I don't think many people know what anthropology is in the United States. So I think we do have to do a better job of pushing back against that. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but yeah, I could talk about that for hours.
Okay, so we'll go on to Ahmed's question next. Gabesh, I can see your hand is up, but I think Ahmed's question came first in the chat, so you can go next. So Ahmed says, concerning, so he says, thanks for this wonderful talk and discussion. Concerning the time of warfare in early times, 58 skeletons dated 14 to 12,000 years ago from the site of Jebel Sahaba in the Sudan introduced evidence of warfare. 40% of the skeletons show traces of various blows, injuries, and cut marks. Projectile lithic points were found stuck in their bones as indications of group fighting, but recent anthropological study concluded that they are quite a healthy group of humans, and they lived in an abundant environment, and the conflict was not to control over the scarce environmental resources. So the question is, what do you think about the reason of such warfare like this in early times?
Yeah, that's a great question. If I had the answer, I'd be at Harvard, I think. But yeah, I mean, I would think that, you know, people fight for many, many reasons. And maybe we're too set in these sort of deterministic, and not that the question's asking this, but I think in general, we're set in these notions that, well, warfare only happens because you want to increase your inclusive fitness. That, okay, I'm only going to kill someone because it would make me have more kids in the end. But war happens for all kinds of reasons. So what happened at Jebel Sahaba? Yeah, I don't know. You know, maybe people fight over lands that are abundant, right? Maybe there was a social aspect. Maybe there was a ritual reason. Maybe that was a sacred land where both people wanted to be. Maybe someone got pissed off and angry, and they used that as an excuse, right? Maybe they had something they wanted. So yeah, I mean, I think it's a good point, and I think that that line of evidence is really strong to sort of see this sort of. Then it used to be, yeah, okay, people fought when climate went bad. This is very big in the Southwest in the United States. There's other reasons though as well. So yeah, I think I wish I knew, but I think that yeah, it could easily be that social aspects of warfare perhaps have been under theorized for the Pleistocene. Would be maybe my scientific way of responding to that. Thanks for that question. That's a good one.
Okay, Gapesh, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Sorry, there's too much noise in the background in the lab. So, hey, Mark. First of all, I wanted to ask, like, there's too much of semiosis, first of all. I wanted to ask one thing. So we have 3 words which are quite, we have to understand, but aggression, violence, and warfare, which shows the different or increasing level of intensity. Now, talking about the Pleistocene, when we talk about us or our ancestors becoming scavengers to the hunters, and that transition itself marks that we are becoming aggressive in terms of our food procurement strategies. So how do you put those kind of evidences like Shawinigan or Toralba Ambrona, where you have mass hunting of the different forms of communities? Do you think we have to put and interpret those evidences in the picture of warfare, or we becoming violent as a species? Second question is quite interesting one. I like it. Like, there are lots of recent talks and discussions by Chris Stringer. He talks about very unique concept, the survival of the friendliest. So how do you see survival of the friendliest in this whole context and whole matrix? That's all.
Thanks. So yeah, I'll try to get to both. So I think survival of the friendliest is a great example. Right? Brian Hare and others. Like, I think, and that's kind of where we're leading, right? There's been a sea change, right? I think in the last 10 to 15 years of pointing out that it's not all about sex and violence. And I think that's a really good point. And that's something, yeah, I mean, the fact that most humans do get along with each other. The fact that, at least in the United States, it takes a lot of work to convince somebody to go to war and to kill somebody else. There's a lot of research that suggests people fight back against that and they don't want to kill somebody. So yeah, I think that there's a lot there in terms of looking at domestication and how we interact with dogs, right? All this stuff is really, really great. For your first point, I think if I understood correctly about like the sort of evidence of like hunting, and is that related to evidence of war? Yeah, maybe, probably, like I said, like if you're fighting, if you have a weapon and you're gonna fight somebody, yeah, of course you could use it to somebody else. Travis Pickering has a book called like Human Aggression. I can't remember the name of the book, but where it tries to track hunting as the response to related to warfare. It's possible. I think it's totally interesting. I just don't know resolution-wise whether we would get that, whether we'd know enough. But it's a fair point. Like, I mean, like, yeah, stuff at Shawinigan are fascinating, right? There's so much cool stuff coming out of there, and I guess the question is whether or not hominins or humans, whatever you want to call it at that time, if they were seeing other humans as part of their group or not, might be part of it. But yeah, I don't know. That's a really great question. I got to think more about that.
Okay, so next question. So it might be similar to Hugh's, but do you have a sort of sense of public opinion on the evolutionary origins of human violence and altruism? And do you feel that it has an effect on present day violence? So for example, if someone believes that violence is innate, might that have a social impact?
So I guess, let me think. The answer is I would love to know. I've asked my students and like when I give talks, and I think again, like, there is a sampling bias here. When I talk to people, most of them sort of think humans are innately violent, which is interesting because, Larry Keeley's book in the 1990s, and even nowadays, a lot of books would say, oh, everyone thinks humans get along, but I'm going to prove them wrong. I think, because you can read the news, I think the notion that, I guess the public opinion that I see is that humans are violent, and that maybe altruism is a good thing, but we're not very good at altruism, and we need to work toward it. I think the last part, if somebody was, might that impact them socially? I don't know. I think it might give them a more predisposition to distrust people. It also might give them a predisposition to be more willing to say, oh, that's just my innateness talking, right? Sometimes these things are used in like court in the court, right? Oh, well, you're innately violent, so of course you're going to act this way. But I think I don't know if it has I don't know what effect it has in present day violence, other than sometimes maybe it's used to excuse that, if that makes sense. It's a great question. I wish I knew more. I've been trying to find out more about this. Like, what does the general public think about these questions? It's more of, I guess, for a political scientist to find out. But yeah, my guess is that most people do think we're violent by nature. Which, again, when I talk to people about this, my colleague Augustine Fuentes, he always points out very, I think, astutely, that you'll see the New York Times headline that 7 people were murdered in Manhattan. but you'll never see the New York Times headline that 7 million people got along in Manhattan. And both are equally true. So I think we're also biased in terms of how the news reports this kind of stuff.
We've got 2 more questions in the chat. So the next one is from John Gowlett. He says, I think, maybe wrongly, that you contrast small-scale hunter-gatherer warfare with modern large-scale war more implicitly than directly. Are there any useful generalizations to make?
That's a great question, John. I got to think more about that. You know, the reason why we did that in that paper was to point out that you can't, that basically that doing that contrast for this question might be looking at the wrong thing, because you compare the population scale is so off. Are there any useful generalizations to make? I honestly don't know. You know, I almost wasn't going to talk about that paper because I do think there's a lot of assumptions we have to make in these things, and obviously, you know, your work does this so well to point out the issues here. I would think that the useful generalizations to make are essentially that when we're talking about these questions of are we innately warlike, or are we innately peaceful, 2 things. First off, you know, we have to sort of keep all these factors in mind. So when the popular science says, okay, look, this population is warlike, and this maybe goes back to the previous question, this population is warlike, people living in cities and civilizations are less warlike, that is actually really insidious too, I think. And I think has been used sometimes as for governments to control foraging populations by saying, oh, we have to control these people, otherwise they have this sort of tendency to be violent. I'm not sure if there are any other useful generalizations other than as well to keep in mind that population size does sort of affect these attempts to sort of look at the differences between like the ratios of the size of the word groups. That may not answer your question very well. I do, if it doesn't, I apologize. Oh, good.
Okay, so last question is from Bruce Gibson. He says, the question of crossovers with popular culture today is very interesting. To what extent do you think that academic reflection on issues like the origins of warfare is itself still being shaped by earlier thought from thinkers like Hobbes and Locke on the state of nature? The state of nature.
Wow, that's an excellent question. I love that. So I think, I mean, for Western scholars, right, people reading that kind of literature, probably a heck of a lot. I would think that a lot of scholars are probably not reading Hobbes and Locke, right? They're probably reading what other people are saying Hobbes and Locke said. But certainly, I mean, if you read, you know, Steve Pinker's work, that is sort of the crux of his argument, right? Is that Hobbes was wrong. There was not Hobbes was right, and that the Leviathan, I mean, Pinker uses the word Leviathan from Hobbes, that the Leviathan is making us better. I think we're very, at least in the Western world, I should say, very much influenced by these sort of early white male thinkers telling us it's either one or the other, right? And it does sort of maybe, this may not be your question, but thinking as well that we tend to get locked into these sort of dichotomies, that this is the way it was. I'm no expert, but I think even for Hobbes, when he was writing, he wasn't saying there was a state of nature. It was a thought experiment for him to think about what might it have been like. But certainly, yeah, I think I didn't really mention it too much, but I do think academics are more influenced by our predecessors than we might believe, and also by popular culture, right? I don't know if this is a myth, but there was always a claim that someone had looked at a study of, well, how do people look at the Neanderthals? And over time, your view of the Neanderthals have shifted, often based upon what sort of culture you grew up in, and sort of were you around during, you know, Vietnam or post-Vietnam, and how do you sort of see violence and aggression there? This is a long way of saying I don't know the answer to this question, but I do think it is true. I think that almost every paper on this topic has to reference Hobbes and Locke. I purposely didn't mention them because I wanted to buck that trend. But yeah, I think the answer is yes. I think that we are easily influenced by these dudes now. And it would also be really helpful if we mentioned Eastern philosophy and thought of other ways of seeing the world outside of these sort of locks into like, state of nature, blank slate debates.
Okay, cool. Thank you. And thanks everyone for the questions as well. So I guess we can go ahead and end it there. So thanks for joining us today, Marc, and thanks everyone for coming along. We look forward to seeing everyone next week. So bye.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. It was so nice to see faces.